Title: Female pilot's affair with a sheik turns into shocking HIV revenge on her co-pilot. Crime story ***. The sun had barely set, casting a dim, orange glow across the airport tarmac. Captain Lara Williams sat in the cockpit, her fingers tapping nervously on the controls. She could feel the weight of the secret pressing down on her chest. Her affair with Sheikh Abdullah, a wealthy businessman, had been thrilling but dangerous. It was supposed to be a temporary distraction, something to break the monotony of long flights. But as the days passed, the affair spiraled into something far darker. Abdullah had promised her the world: luxury, power, and pleasure. But with every intimate encounter, Lara felt a growing sense of dread. He was possessive, controlling, and had ties to dangerous circles. And yet, the pull of his wealth and charm had kept her hooked. The plane was now on its descent, the city lights twinkling below like a sea of stars. Beside her in the cockpit was her co-pilot, David. He was focused on the instruments, unaware of the turmoil inside her. But Lara couldn't stop thinking about the conversation she'd had with Abdullah last night. "You've made a mistake, Lara," Abdullah had said, his voice cold as ice. "The game is not over." Lara had tried to dismiss his words, but they haunted her. She had no idea what he meant. All she knew was that something was coming, something she couldn't control. As the plane approached the runway, Lara's hands shook. David glanced at her, sensing her unease. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice steady. Lara forced a smile, masking the chaos inside her. "I'm fine," she lied. The landing was smooth, but the tension was thick in the air. Once they had safely arrived at the gate, the crew disembarked, the hum of the plane's engines fading away. But before Lara could make her way to the terminal, she felt a sharp pain in her chest. It was as if someone had punched her, hard and unexpectedly. A message flashed on her phone, Abdullah's name glaring on the screen. Her heart skipped a beat as she opened the message. "David will never know," it read, "but he's been infected." Lara froze, her breath catching in her throat. Her stomach twisted into knots. She dropped the phone, feeling the world spin around her. It wasn't possible, but she knew it was true. Abdullah had given her HIV, and she had unknowingly passed it on to David. The plan had been set in motion, revenge, dark and unforgiving. David stood a few feet away, chatting with the flight attendants. He was blissfully unaware of the horror that had just been unleashed. Lara's pulse raced as her eyes flicked between him and the phone. The anger, the betrayal, it was all too much. Her hands trembled as she grabbed her bag. She needed to get away. But as she turned to leave, she saw David's face. He was looking right at her, his expression filled with confusion and concern. "Is everything okay, Captain?" he asked, his voice soft but penetrating. Lara could only nod, forcing herself to hold it together. The weight of the secret would haunt her forever, but she had no choice but to keep it locked inside. For the rest of the night, Lara couldn't shake the feeling that her world was unraveling. Each step she took felt heavier than the last. She had been a pawn in a game far bigger than she had ever imagined. And now, David would pay the price. The sun had set hours ago, but it felt as if darkness was closing in on her. A storm was coming, one she couldn't escape. And in the end, revenge would be the price of her affair. The days that followed were a blur for Lara. She went through the motions of her daily life, but the weight of the secret hung over her like a dark cloud. David, unaware of the threat looming over him, continued to greet her with his usual friendly smile. But each time their eyes met, Lara felt a stab of guilt in her chest, sharper than before. She couldn't escape the thought of him, his innocence, his trust. What had she done? The shame gnawed at her insides, but there was no turning back. Abdullah's revenge had been set in motion, and nothing could stop it now. Weeks passed, and Lara noticed a change in David. He seemed more tired than usual, his energy drained, his face pale. At first, she dismissed it as stress from the demanding flights. But deep down, she knew it was something more, something darker. One evening, as the crew prepared to board another flight, David collapsed. His body trembled violently, and his breathing became labored. Panic spread like wildfire among the team, and emergency responders rushed to the scene. Lara stood frozen, her heart racing as she watched David being wheeled away. The world around her seemed to slow down, the voices of the crew growing distant. It was happening. The hospital called later that night. David had been diagnosed with full-blown AIDS. The doctors were shocked, given his age and otherwise healthy appearance. Lara's stomach churned as the realization hit her with brutal force. She had never intended for this to happen, but the consequences of her actions were undeniable. David's life would never be the same again, and it was all her fault. That night, Lara couldn't sleep. She paced the floor of her apartment, her thoughts spiraling. She had betrayed her co-pilot, her friend, and herself. And now, the price was more than she could bear. But what could she do now? What was left for her after all of this? She had been trapped in a web of lies, and no matter how much she wanted to escape, it was too late. The next day, she visited David in the hospital. She couldn't bring herself to face him, to see the pain in his eyes. But she knew she had to. She owed him that much. David was sitting up in his bed, his face gaunt and pale, his eyes filled with confusion. When he saw Lara, he didn't speak at first. He just stared at her, searching her face for answers. Finally, he whispered, "Why, Lara? Why didn't you tell me?" The words hit her like a slap. She wanted to break down, to confess everything, but she couldn't. The truth would destroy him, destroy everything. I didn't know," Lara stammered, her voice cracking. But the lie tasted bitter on her tongue. She had known. She had always known. David's eyes filled with tears as he turned away from her, unable to look at her any longer. The silence between them was suffocating, and Lara felt every moment of it. She had destroyed the one good thing in her life. As she left the hospital, she felt a strange numbness wash over her. The world outside seemed unreal, as if she were walking through a dream. She had lost everything: David, her career, and most importantly, her soul. But even as she walked away from the hospital, Lara knew that Abdullah's revenge was far from over. There would be more consequences, more victims, and she would be powerless to stop it. The game had turned deadly, and she was just another pawn in a ruthless game of retribution. Days turned into weeks, and the weight of Lara's guilt began to consume her. She couldn't escape the image of David's broken expression, his trust shattered, his future uncertain. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw him, his pale face, the tears in his eyes. And she could feel the guilt clawing at her, threatening to drown her. Lara tried to keep her life moving forward, but everything felt hollow. The airport, the cockpit, the endless flights, nothing mattered anymore. Her heart was heavy with the knowledge that she had destroyed an innocent life. Then one afternoon, as Lara was reviewing flight plans in the office, she received an unexpected call. It was from a number she didn't recognize, but she answered anyway. The voice on the other end sent a chill down her spine. "You should have stayed away from him," the voice said, cold and menacing. Lara's blood ran cold as she recognized the tone. Abdullah. Her heart pounded in her chest as she waited for him to continue. "I gave you everything," he said, his voice now low and calculating. "But you were too careless. You played with fire, and now you're going to pay the price." Lara's stomach twisted with fear as his words sank in. What more could he want from her? "You think this is over?" Abdullah sneered. "You think you're safe because David's suffering?" "No, Lara. This is just the beginning." Lara's mind raced. What did he mean by that? What more could he do to her? But before she could ask, the line went dead. The fear that had been creeping at the edges of her mind now consumed her whole. Abdullah wasn't finished with her. And whatever he had planned next, she wasn't prepared for it. The next few days were a blur of paranoia. Lara couldn't shake the feeling that someone was always watching her. Every glance, every whisper, sent her into a frenzy. She began to feel like a prisoner in her own life. Then, one night, as she returned to her apartment, she found a letter waiting for her at the door. It was unmarked, just a plain envelope with no return address. Her hands trembled as she opened it, a sense of dread filling her. Inside was a single piece of paper with a message written in bold, dark letters. Asterisk, the game isn't over. You will pay for what you've done. Asterisk. The words sent a shiver down her spine. She felt trapped, cornered, as if there was no way out. Abdullah had put her in a position where she had no control, no escape. Lara knew then that the price of her affair with the sheik was much higher than she had ever imagined. It wasn't just her career or her freedom at stake now. Her life was in jeopardy, and the consequences of her actions were far-reaching. She tried to contact David to apologize, to explain, but he refused to speak to her. The anger and betrayal were too much for him to forgive. And she understood. She didn't deserve his forgiveness. As the days passed, Lara's fear grew. She could feel the noose tightening around her, each step closer to the inevitable. Abdullah's revenge was coming for her, and she knew there was nothing she could do to stop it. The once glamorous world she had been a part of now felt like a prison. She had become a shadow of her former self, hunted, broken, and alone. And the worst part was, she had no one to blame but herself. One night, as she stood on the edge of a rooftop, looking out over the city, Lara thought about everything she had lost. Her affair with Abdullah had seemed like a thrilling escape, a temporary indulgence. But now, it had turned into a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. The city below seemed so far away, so distant, and yet, the darkness felt all too close. Lara closed her eyes, trying to block out the rising panic in her chest. But no matter how hard she tried, the fear wouldn't go away. Abdullah's revenge was inevitable, and Lara was powerless to stop it. Her world had crumbled, and she had no one to turn to. In the end, it was clear she had lost everything. Lara stood on the edge of the rooftop, the cool breeze whipping through her hair, but it didn't soothe her. The weight of her decisions pressed down on her like an anchor, dragging her deeper into despair. The city below seemed so vast, so full of life, and yet she felt utterly alone in it. Abdullah's revenge was creeping closer, and every hour that passed felt like another step toward her inevitable downfall. She thought about the life she had before all of this, her career, her freedom, her integrity. Now, those things felt like distant memories, slipping further away with every passing moment. Her thoughts wandered to David again, the way he had trusted her, the way she had shattered that trust. If only she could take it all back. But there was no going back now. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her dark thoughts. It was an unknown number, but she hesitated before answering. A chill ran through her as she picked up. Lara, the voice on the other end was unmistakable. It was Abdullah. "You thought I was done with you, didn't you?" he said, his voice dripping with venom. Lara's heart raced as he continued, each word laced with malice. "I've been watching you, Lara. You've been running from your mistakes, but now they've caught up with you." Lara's breath caught in her throat. What did he want from her? What more could he possibly do? "David's pain is nothing compared to what's coming for you," Abdullah continued, his voice low and menacing. "You're going to learn what it means to play with fire, and this time, you won't get out unscathed." Lara felt the blood drain from her face as the words sank in. She had no idea what Abdullah was capable of, but the fear gnawed at her, consuming every rational thought. The call ended abruptly, and Lara was left standing in stunned silence. The wind around her seemed to grow colder, the city lights flickering below her like distant stars in an endless void. She had no way out, no way to escape the consequences of her actions. As the days passed, the sense of impending doom only grew stronger. Lara's mind was constantly on edge, her nerves frayed. Every shadow, every whisper, felt like a threat. She couldn't trust anyone anymore. Abdullah's reach was vast, and she was powerless to stop him. Then, one evening, as Lara returned to her apartment after another sleepless day, she found a package waiting for her. The box was plain, unmarked, but her name was written on the side in bold, cold letters. Her hands trembled as she tore it open. Inside was a single photo, David, lying in a hospital bed, his face gaunt and drawn. The image sent a pang of guilt through her chest, but there was more. Beneath the photo was a note. Asterisk, this is just the beginning. You will feel his suffering soon enough. Asterisk, the message was clear. Abdullah wasn't done, and neither was the twisted game he had set in motion. Lara's heart pounded in her chest as panic began to rise once again. She had no one to turn to, no way to fix what she had done. The guilt of destroying David's life, of allowing Abdullah's revenge to unfold, was eating her alive. The next few days were the darkest she had ever known. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't focus. The walls of her apartment felt like they were closing in on her, suffocating her with every passing second. She felt trapped, as though the walls were closing in and there was no way out. Her every movement was watched, every step calculated. Abdullah had cornered her in a way she never thought possible. It wasn't just her career, her reputation, or her life anymore. It was her soul. And as the days turned into weeks, Lara realized that the price for her affair, for her betrayal, was far higher than she ever imagined. Abdullah's revenge would consume her completely, just as it had consumed David. In the final moments, Lara knew one thing for sure. She was the architect of her own destruction, and the consequences of her choices would haunt her forever. The days blurred together, each one darker and more suffocating than the last. Lara had become a shell of the woman she once was, her every thought consumed by fear and regret. Abdullah's presence was like a shadow following her wherever she went. She could feel it in the silence of her apartment, in the tension that gripped her every movement. She couldn't escape the feeling that something was about to break, something that could never be repaired. Her once promising career as a pilot felt like a distant memory, overshadowed by the nightmare she had brought upon herself. Every day was a countdown to whatever Abdullah had planned next, and Lara knew she wouldn't be able to stop it. Then, one evening, a knock on her door broke the silence. Lara froze, her heart racing as she looked through the peephole. It was David. She hadn't seen him in weeks, not since the hospital, but there he stood, looking worn and fragile. His eyes met hers through the peephole, and a mixture of pain and betrayal reflected back at her. For a moment, Lara thought her heart would stop. Was this the moment he would confront her? Demand answers? With a trembling hand, she opened the door. David stood there, his face pale and eyes bloodshot. He looked as though he hadn't slept in days, his body shaking with the weight of whatever was happening to him. You don't have to say anything, Lara, David said quietly, his voice hoarse. I know everything. Lara's breath caught in her throat as she stepped back, unable to speak. David looked down at the ground for a moment, gathering his thoughts, then raised his eyes to hers. Abdullah, he did this to me, didn't he? Lara swallowed hard, unable to hold back the tears that burned in her eyes. She nodded, unable to find the words to explain the depth of her betrayal. David's expression darkened as he took a step toward her. You used me. You put my life in his hands, he said, his voice shaking with anger and disbelief. And now I'm paying the price. Lara couldn't look at him. She wanted to say something, anything, to make things right, but the words were stuck in her throat. There was no way to undo the damage. David let out a bitter laugh, his eyes bitter with the weight of the truth. You think I don't know why you did it? The affair, the secrecy, you thought it would make you feel powerful. But now look at us. Look at what it's cost. Lara felt as though the walls were closing in on her. She wanted to apologize, to tell him how deeply sorry she was, but the truth was, it was too late. There was no redemption. David was right. She had destroyed everything, and now she would live with the consequences. David turned to leave, but then paused. He glanced back at her, his eyes filled with a quiet rage. Abdullah's not finished. Neither are you. The words sent a chill down her spine. She had already known it, but hearing it from David, with all the pain in his voice, made it feel even more real. Abdullah's grip on her life was tightening with every passing second. As the door closed behind David, Lara sank to her knees, her head spinning with the weight of it all. She had made her choices, and now they were all coming home to roost. There was no escaping the consequences, no way to fix what had been broken. Lara's life had unraveled in ways she never imagined possible. Abdullah's revenge had torn through everything. Her career, her relationships, her dignity. And now, there was no way out. In the weeks that followed, Lara did everything she could to try to piece her life back together. but it felt like trying to rebuild a shattered mirror, with each shard cutting deeper into her soul. Abdullah's shadow loomed over every moment, every breath she took. Her flight career was over, of course. There was no coming back from what had happened. And David, the man she had hurt most, had vanished from her life completely. She was left to wander through the wreckage of her choices, with nothing but guilt and regret as her companions. As she looked out over the city one last time, Lara knew the truth. She had lost everything. And the only thing that remained was the endless, suffocating darkness that now consumed her life. Lara stood at the window, staring out at the city below, but the lights no longer seemed to offer any comfort. The street she had once known felt alien, distant, as though she no longer belonged in that world. Everything had changed, and not for the better. Abdullah's revenge had taken everything from her. Her career, her reputation, her relationships, and her peace of mind. Her phone buzzed again, snapping her out of her thoughts. Another call from an unknown number. She hesitated before answering, her heart racing in her chest. Lara, the voice on the other end sent chills down her spine. It was Abdullah. Her pulse quickened as she listened, her hands trembling. "I told you it wasn't over," he said, his voice smooth but laced with malice. "You think you've suffered enough? That David's pain was enough? No. You will feel the full weight of your actions soon." Lara's throat tightened as she struggled to breathe. Her mind raced, but she had no idea what he meant. Hadn't she lost enough? Wasn't it enough that David was suffering, that her life was in ruins? "You've been running from your mistakes, but now they're going to catch up with you in ways you can't even imagine," Abdullah continued, each word like a dagger in her heart. "You won't be able to run, Lara. Not anymore." The line went dead, and Lara stood there, her phone still pressed to her ear, the silence ringing in her ears. She wanted to throw it across the room, to scream out in frustration and fear. But there was no escaping the truth. Abdullah wasn't finished with her. Days turned into a haze of dread and anticipation. Lara couldn't focus on anything, couldn't stop the swirling thoughts of what Abdullah might do next. She felt like a puppet, with strings pulled by someone far more dangerous and ruthless than she had ever anticipated. And then it happened, the one thing that shattered her completely. One morning, as she walked into her office, a package was waiting for her. No return address, just a plain, brown box. Her hands shook as she opened it, the weight of the moment sinking in. Inside, there was a letter. But it wasn't just any letter. It was a photograph of her. Taken from a distance, it showed her standing outside her apartment, looking over her shoulder as if she knew someone was watching. Her breath caught in her throat as she read the note that accompanied it. Asterisk, you can run, but you can't hide. Your every move is being watched. Every step you take, I am there. Asterisk. Lara felt her world collapse in that moment. It wasn't just her career, her future, or her safety at stake anymore. It was her very existence. Abdullah had found a way to break her in ways she couldn't comprehend. The feeling of being hunted was overwhelming. Every time she left her apartment, every shadow seemed to loom larger. Every car that passed, every passerby, felt like a threat. She couldn't even go to the store without feeling like someone was watching, waiting. It wasn't long before she began to question her sanity. Was Abdullah really everywhere? Or was it just the paranoia eating away at her? She couldn't tell anymore. But one thing was certain, Abdullah had control. He had taken everything from her, piece by piece, and now he was going to make sure she felt every ounce of it. In the days that followed, Lara's desperation grew. She tried to run, tried to escape to a new city, to start over. But everywhere she went, she felt the grip of Abdullah's vengeance tightening around her. There was no escape, no freedom, no redemption. In the end, Lara understood the brutal truth. Abdullah had won, and she was nothing more than a pawn in his ruthless game of revenge. Her life had become a series of movements dictated by fear, with no way to break free. She had been consumed by her own choices, and now there was no way out. Abdullah's revenge had taken root so deep in her life that she would never be free again. And so, as Lara stood in the dim light of her apartment, the weight of her past crashing down around her, she realized that the price of betrayal wasn't just the loss of everything she had. It was the slow, suffocating agony of living with the consequences. A life bound by guilt, haunted by a vengeance that would never let go. Lara's existence had become a suffocating loop, a cycle of dread and isolation she couldn't escape. The world around her seemed to blur, losing its vibrancy, as though her entire reality had been dimmed by Abdullah's shadow. She woke up each day with a sense of dread hanging over her, each step outside her apartment a calculated risk. The walls of her once comfortable life had closed in on her, turning every corner into a potential threat. Each morning, the phone calls, the mysterious packages, and the constant fear of being watched were reminders of the web Abdullah had woven around her. No one could be trusted, not even the people who had once been her friends. She couldn't speak to anyone about what was happening. No one would believe her. One night, unable to sleep, Lara went to the balcony of her apartment. The cool night air brushed against her skin, but it did little to calm the turmoil inside her. She stared out over the city, the lights flickering below, feeling like a ghost in her own life. Then something caught her eye, a figure in the distance, standing under a streetlight. At first, she thought it was a trick of the mind, but as she looked closer, her heart dropped. It was a man. He was watching her apartment. The shock hit her like a physical blow. It was him, Abdullah, or one of his men. She couldn't tell. But the message was clear. He was still watching her. Lara's body froze, the panic rising in her chest like a tidal wave. What did he want now? Would he show up at her door? Would she be dragged back into that hell she thought she had escaped? She couldn't wait to find out. She grabbed her coat, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the door handle. She had to leave. She had to get out before it was too late. Her heart pounded as she hurried down the stairs of her building, each step feeling like a race against time. She couldn't think, couldn't process what was happening. The fear had taken over, and her instincts told her to run. But as soon as she stepped outside, she realized she had made a fatal mistake. The streets were empty, eerily so. There was no one around, no cars, no people, just the quiet hum of the city at night. Then, from the darkness, a car pulled up. Lara's breath caught in her throat as the headlights shone in her face. The car stopped, and the door opened slowly. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a voice, a familiar voice, but one she had hoped never to hear again. "Get in, Lara." It was Abdullah. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her mind screamed for her to run, but her legs were frozen. She was trapped. She had nowhere to go. Abdullah's voice rang out again, sharper now, impatient. "I said get in." Lara took a hesitant step forward, every instinct telling her to flee, but she was too terrified to move. Abdullah had her cornered, just like he had before. And no matter how hard she tried, there was no escaping his grasp. Trembling, she slid into the back seat of the car, the door clicking shut behind her with a finality that sent a chill through her spine. The engine roared to life, and the car sped off into the night, leaving the city's lights behind. As they drove in silence, Lara couldn't shake the feeling that she was being pulled into something darker, something she couldn't outrun. She had never imagined her life would end up like this. A prisoner of her own past, a pawn in Abdullah's twisted game. Finally, Abdullah spoke. "You thought you could escape, didn't you?" he said, his voice cold and indifferent. "Your choices have led you here, Lara. You've walked into your own nightmare." Lara's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to protest, to say that she had learned her lesson, that she was sorry. But there was no point. Abdullah had already won. The car turned onto a dark, deserted road, and Lara had no idea where they were going. She was too afraid to ask. As the night stretched on, it became clear that the nightmare was far from over. And whatever lay ahead, Lara knew one thing. She would never escape the consequences of her actions. The car continued its relentless journey down the dark road, the headlights cutting through the night like a blade. Lara's mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest. She glanced at Abdullah, who sat motionless in the front seat, his face obscured by shadows. The silence between them was suffocating. The only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional creak of the tires against the road. Lara wanted to say something, Anything, but the words wouldn't come. What could she possibly say that would change anything? She had already betrayed him. She had already let her own ambition and desires blind her to the consequences. The car slowed, and they turned onto a narrow, secluded street. The houses here were old, their windows dark, the air thick with an eerie stillness. Lara felt the weight of the place press down on her, a sense of foreboding that made her skin crawl. Abdullah finally spoke, his voice low and controlled. "You should have known better, Lara," he said, his words cutting through the silence like a knife. "You thought you could play a game with me and win. But now, you're learning what happens when you make enemies like me." His words were cold, but there was a terrifying certainty in them that sent a chill through her bones. She had always known Abdullah was ruthless, but the reality of it hit her in that moment. He had been playing the long game, and now it was her turn to feel the full extent of his revenge. The car came to a stop in front of a large, intimidating mansion. Lara's stomach twisted into knots as she stared up at it. This wasn't just any house. It was a fortress, a place where people disappeared. "Get out," Abdullah commanded, his voice devoid of emotion. Lara hesitated for a moment before slowly opening the door and stepping out into the night air. The cold bite of the wind hit her face, but it did little to ease the suffocating fear that gripped her heart. Abdullah was already standing beside her, motioning for her to follow him. With a sense of dread, Lara obeyed, walking up the stone path leading to the front door. As they entered the mansion, the heavy wooden doors closed behind them with a loud thud. The interior of the mansion was cold and impersonal, the walls adorned with dark paintings and dim lighting that made everything feel distant and unwelcoming. Abdullah led her down a long corridor, his footsteps echoing through the silence. Finally, they arrived at a large room at the end of the hall, its door already open. Inside, there was a large chair in the center of the room, and surrounding it a series of monitors, each displaying various rooms of the mansion. Lara's stomach churned as she realized what was happening. Abdullah had been watching her every move, every step she took. He had known where she was, who she was with, and what she had done. He turned to her, his eyes cold and unfeeling. "Sit down," he instructed, his voice like ice. Lara slowly walked toward the chair, her legs shaky, and sat down. The moment she did, she felt an overwhelming sense of vulnerability. There was no escape now. Abdullah stepped to one of the monitors, his fingers moving deftly over the controls. The screen flickered, and soon, it was filled with footage of Lara. Footage of her apartment, her walks through the city, her meetings with friends, her every move. It was as if he had been in her life all along, unseen and untouchable. "You think you can escape me?" he said, his voice low and filled with contempt. "You're mine now, Lara. There's nowhere left for you to go." Lara's pulse raced as she realized the full extent of his control. Abdullah had orchestrated every moment of her life since the affair. He had watched her fall, and now he was ready to crush her completely. Her body trembled as she tried to find the strength to speak, but the words stuck in her throat. What could she say? How could she possibly explain the remorse she felt when faced with the monster before her? Abdullah turned from the monitor and walked toward her, his presence suffocating. "You will pay the price for your actions, Lara," he said, his voice steady but filled with the promise of pain. "There is no redemption for you. You've lost everything." Lara's eyes filled with tears, but she couldn't move. She had no power here, no control over her own fate. She was trapped, and the consequences of her choices had finally caught up with her. Abdullah stood before her, his gaze unwavering. "This is your new reality. You belong to me now, Lara, and no one, not even you, can change that." As the words hung in the air, Lara knew deep in her soul that she had crossed a line that could never be undone. Abdullah had exacted his revenge, and it was a price she would never be able to pay. Lara sat there, her body frozen, her mind overwhelmed by the brutal reality of what had just been said. The walls of the room seemed to close in on her, and she felt the weight of her past mistakes bearing down on her like a physical force. Abdullah's eyes were cold, calculating, as he towered over her. There was no warmth, no hint of mercy, only the unrelenting gaze of a man who had orchestrated this moment with precise cruelty. He was in control, and she was nothing more than a pawn in his hands. She opened her mouth to speak, to plead for some kind of mercy, but the words caught in her throat. There was no point, no pleading, no escape. Abdullah leaned in closer, his face now inches from hers. "You should have known better than to betray me," he whispered. "You thought you could play me, but in the end I always get what I want." Her breath quickened as the room seemed to grow darker, the shadows around her growing deeper. She felt a pang of regret, a sharp sting of guilt that threatened to consume her. The affair, the lies, the betrayal, they had all led her to this moment. For a long moment, the room was silent, save for the distant hum of the mansion's quiet machinery. Lara's thoughts swirled in a haze of fear and regret. She had never imagined her life would spiral so completely out of control. Finally, Abdullah broke the silence. "You'll stay here under my watch. Your freedom is gone, and you will remember this every day, every hour of your life." He straightened up and turned away, walking toward the far side of the room where a door stood. Lara wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to move. The weight of her situation had immobilized her, trapping her in the suffocating grip of her own choices. Abdullah reached for the door, and before he opened it, he turned back to face her one last time. His eyes gleamed with finality. "This is the life you've chosen, Lara," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You wanted power, freedom, and luxury. Now you have it. But it comes at a price, and the price is your soul." With those words, he left the room, the door closing behind him with a soft click. Lara was alone again, but this time it was different. There was no more hope, no more light at the end of the tunnel. She was trapped in a nightmare of her own making. As she sat there in the dark, her thoughts slowly began to piece together the truth. She had been warned. There had been moments, signs that she had ignored, and now she would pay the ultimate price. The silence around her was deafening, and with it came the crushing realization that she would never escape Abdullah's grip. Her life, as she knew it, was over, and there would be no redemption, no second chances. Lara's body sank deeper into the chair as the weight of her own guilt and fear settled on her shoulders. The once vibrant, ambitious woman was now a broken shell, bound to the unforgiving consequences of her choices. Outside, the world moved on. But for Lara, time had stopped, and she would spend the rest of her life paying for the affair that had destroyed her. Days blurred into nights as Lara sat in the cold, dim room. The once gleaming life she had fought for now seemed like a distant dream, fading further with each passing second. Abdullah's grip on her was suffocating, but there was no escape. No one could save her. The mansion became her prison. Each day, she followed Abdullah's orders without question, too afraid to do anything that might provoke him further. Her every movement was monitored, every decision scrutinized. She was no longer Lara, the pilot, the woman with ambitions and desires, but just a shadow of her former self, a prisoner of her past. Abdullah made sure she understood who was in control. There were no moments of kindness, no slips of mercy, only the cold, unrelenting punishment that he had planned for her. Every time she dared to look up, his eyes were there, watching, judging. Lara tried to keep her mind active, to hold on to fragments of hope. She thought of her life before the affair, flying across the skies, the thrill of independence, the freedom she had once taken for granted. But those memories now felt like a cruel joke. One evening, as the mansion settled into its usual eerie quiet, Lara stood by the window, gazing out into the night. She could see the lights of the city in the distance, a stark reminder of everything she had lost. The world was moving on without her, and she was being left behind in the darkness. Her reflection in the window seemed foreign, her face gaunt, her eyes hollow. What had she become? She had been so sure of herself once, but now she felt like a ghost, trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake from. Suddenly, a loud knock on the door startled her. Her heart raced, the familiar feeling of dread settling over her. It was Abdullah. She braced herself, trying to keep the fear from overwhelming her. The door creaked open, and Abdullah stood there, his figure looming in the doorway like a dark shadow. He stepped inside, and for a moment, the silence between them was deafening. "Lara," he said, his voice low but controlled. "You've had time to reflect, haven't you?" Lara didn't respond. What was there to say? Her silence spoke volumes. Abdullah walked closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "You've been a disappointment," he said, his tone sharp. "You could have had it all, but now, you've lost everything." He circled her slowly, like a predator toying with its prey. Lara stood still, her eyes cast downward, unwilling to meet his gaze. "I've given you everything," he continued, "and you've squandered it. But now, I think it's time for you to understand the real cost of your actions." Her stomach twisted in fear as she realized what he was implying. What more could he do to her? He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, black device. It looked like a remote, but Lara didn't need to ask. She could see the way his fingers danced over it, with the same cold precision he always had. "Do you remember how it felt, Lara?" he asked. His voice was barely above a whisper, but it sent chills down her spine. "How you thought you could control the situation. How you thought you could walk away without consequences." Lara's heart raced, her body trembling in the stillness of the room. The air felt thick with tension, and her mind screamed at her to run, to find any way out. But there was nowhere to go. "Now," Abdullah said, his voice almost a sneer, "you will truly understand what it means to be mine." The device in his hand beeped, and the room seemed to darken even further. Lara's vision blurred as a wave of dizziness swept over her. She stumbled back, but Abdullah was right there, steadying her with his unyielding grip. "Every action has consequences," he said. "And now, you'll bear the weight of yours." Lara's body felt weak, and her mind raced with panic. What was happening to her? What had he done? Her knees buckled, and she collapsed into his arms. For a moment, everything spun out of control. The world around her was a blur, her thoughts scattered like leaves in the wind. Abdullah's cold voice echoed in her ears, and the last thing she heard before everything went black was his laugh. A laugh that sent a chill through her soul, a laugh that made it clear she had become nothing more than a pawn in his twisted game. The darkness swallowed her whole, and in that moment, Lara knew that she would never escape the consequences of her choices. Not now, not ever. Lara awoke in a cold, sterile room. The walls were white, almost blinding in their starkness, and the harsh fluorescent lights buzzed above her head. Her body felt heavy, like it had been drained of all energy, and her head throbbed with a dull ache. As she slowly came to her senses, she realized she was lying on a metal table, her wrists bound to the arms of the chair. Her mind was foggy, and the last moments before she lost consciousness were a blur. The fear was still there, lingering like a shadow in the back of her mind. A door opened, and footsteps approached. Lara tried to move, but her body wouldn't obey her commands. She felt trapped, paralyzed, as Abdullah's shadow appeared in her peripheral vision. "You're awake," his voice came, cold and detached, like the words were nothing more than a passing thought. His figure loomed over her, and she felt his presence like a dark cloud suffocating the room. Lara's throat was dry, and her voice barely escaped as she tried to speak. "What did you do to me?" Her words were weak, fragile, but the fear in her eyes spoke volumes. Abdullah leaned in closer, his eyes gleaming with a dark satisfaction. "Did you really think you could escape the consequences?" he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You thought you were untouchable, but now you'll understand the price of your betrayal." The door opened again, and a man in a white lab coat entered, holding a syringe in his hand. Lara's heart raced in panic as she realized what was coming. "No," she gasped, but it was too late. The man approached her, his face impassive, as he prepared the syringe. She could feel her pulse quicken, the terror rising in her chest. "You've been marked, Lara," Abdullah said, his voice almost gleeful. "This is your punishment, and you'll live with it for the rest of your life." Before she could protest, the needle was pressed into her arm. Lara's body flinched as the cold substance entered her bloodstream, and the world seemed to tilt. Her vision blurred, and the last thing she saw was Abdullah's cold, emotionless face. The darkness took over once again, but this time it wasn't just her body that was being controlled. It was her very soul. Days passed, but Lara lost track of time. She woke up in the same cold room, the same oppressive silence, and the same haunting presence of Abdullah. Her body was weak, her spirit broken. The constant reminder of her punishment, the slow, deliberate unraveling of her life, was a constant ache inside her. She could feel the effects of whatever Abdullah had injected into her, the strange sickness that gripped her. Her body felt foreign, as if it were no longer hers to control. The once proud pilot, the woman who had soared through the skies with ambition and strength, was now reduced to a shell, a captive of her own decisions. Abdullah continued to watch her, his eyes always calculating, always knowing. And with every passing day, Lara felt the walls of her prison grow higher, the darkness closing in tighter. She had nowhere to run, no one to turn to. The fear of what would come next gnawed at her every waking moment. But deep down, Lara knew there was no escape from the twisted game Abdullah had trapped her in. Her world had been reduced to a single, crushing reality. She was nothing more than a pawn in his revenge, and her only role now was to suffer for her mistakes. Lara's mind felt fractured, like the pieces of her former self were slipping through her fingers. Each day, her body grew weaker, the effects of the drug taking a toll on her every muscle, every bone. But it wasn't just the physical pain that crushed her. It was the emotional toll, the knowledge that she had no one to turn to. Abdullah's control over her was absolute. He didn't need to say much. His presence alone was enough to remind her that she was his. Every movement, every glance from him was a reminder of the prison she now inhabited. But despite the oppressive weight of her circumstances, a small flicker of defiance remained in Lara's heart. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep her alive. The part of her that had once dreamed of freedom, of soaring through the skies, refused to die completely. One night, as the hours dragged on, Lara lay in the small, uncomfortable bed they had confined her to. The room was silent, the only sound the soft hum of the mansion's systems. She could feel the cold creeping through the walls, but it wasn't the temperature that made her shiver. It was the suffocating fear that had taken root in her chest. Suddenly, the door creaked open, and Abdullah stepped inside. His eyes locked onto hers with that same cold, calculating gaze. There was no emotion in his expression, no sign of mercy or compassion. He was the embodiment of her worst nightmare. Lara's breath caught in her throat, and she tried to steady her shaking hands. She knew this was it, the moment where her fate would be sealed once and for all. "You've been quiet," Abdullah said, his voice like ice. "Have you come to terms with your punishment yet?" Lara didn't answer immediately. What was there to say? Her words had no power here, but something inside her snapped. "No," she whispered, barely audible. "I haven't." Abdullah raised an eyebrow, surprised by the defiance in her voice. "You still think you can fight me?" he asked, a dark amusement flickering in his eyes. "You've lost, Lara. There's nothing left to fight for." But Lara didn't back down. Her voice was weak, but she found the strength to speak her mind. "I haven't lost," she said, her voice trembling with the smallest trace of defiance. "Not yet." For a moment, Abdullah seemed taken aback by her response. He stepped closer to her, his gaze never leaving hers. "You think I'll let you go?" he said, his voice a low growl. "You think you can somehow escape me?" Lara swallowed hard, her pulse racing. "Not escape," she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "But I will make you regret this." Abdullah's smile faded, replaced by a dark scowl. He leaned in closer, his breath cold against her skin. "You're in no position to make threats, Lara," he hissed. "You are mine." The room seemed to close in around her, and for a moment, Lara feared she had said too much. But then, something unexpected happened. A surge of anger, a burst of adrenaline, coursed through her veins. She wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. She could still feel the echo of her former self, the strong woman who had flown across the world, independent and free. That woman wasn't gone, not completely, and she wouldn't let Abdullah take everything from her. Lara's mind raced as she searched for a way out. She had no weapons, no power, but she still had her wits. And that, she realized, was the one thing Abdullah couldn't control. "I'll make you regret ever crossing me," Lara repeated, her voice now steady, with a new sense of purpose. Her eyes met his with an intensity that surprised even herself. Abdullah studied her for a moment, and for the first time, there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Lara's defiance had shaken him. "You're wasting your time," he said, his voice steady again. "Resistance won't save you." But Lara didn't flinch. She knew her road ahead was fraught with danger. She knew that escape wouldn't come easily, but the fire inside her was alive. And that was all she needed to keep going. "I'll find a way," she whispered to herself, barely audible. And with that, she made the first step toward reclaiming her life, even if it meant facing the darkness head-on. The days that followed felt like an endless cycle of dread and fleeting hope. Lara's body was still frail, but her mind had regained some of its strength. Abdullah had underestimated her, and that was something she would use to her advantage. Every moment, she analyzed the walls of her prison, searching for cracks, anything she could use to break free. The mansion was vast, and though Abdullah kept a tight grip on her movements, there were still moments when she was left alone. Those moments were a chance. Lara knew she couldn't make a move until the time was right. She had to be patient, to keep up the facade of submission while plotting her escape. Every interaction with Abdullah was a reminder of how much he controlled, but also how much she still had left inside her. One evening, as she sat in the dimly lit room, staring at the walls that had become her only companions, she felt the familiar chill of fear creeping back in. The door creaked open, and for a split second, Lara's heart raced. But it wasn't Abdullah who entered this time. It was one of his men, a tall figure in a black suit. "You're needed," he said, his voice harsh and businesslike. Lara's mind raced. Was this her chance? She had to act quickly. She nodded without hesitation, following him down the narrow hallway. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as though she were too weak to resist, just as Abdullah wanted her to appear. But every step was a calculated decision. They reached a small, unguarded room at the far end of the mansion. Lara felt the tension in her body rise, but she kept her expression blank, hiding the flicker of determination that burned in her chest. The man opened the door and gestured for her to enter. Lara stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room for anything that could help her. There was a desk, a chair, and a single window that was slightly ajar, allowing a sliver of cool night air to seep in. Lara's eyes locked on the window. It was small, but just wide enough for her to fit through. Her pulse quickened as she realized what she had to do. But first, she needed a distraction. Her mind worked quickly, piecing together a plan. She could hear the sounds of the mansion's staff moving outside the door. If she timed this right, she could slip away undetected. The man who had led her there stood near the door, his back turned, unaware of her thoughts. Lara took a deep breath and moved silently toward the desk. There was a lamp on it, the soft glow casting long shadows across the room. Lara's hand brushed over the lamp's base as she carefully loosened it from its socket. With one swift motion, she dropped the lamp to the floor. It shattered with a loud crash. The man immediately turned toward the noise, cursing under his breath. In that instant, Lara bolted toward the window, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached it just as the man lunged toward her, but she was faster. Her hands gripped the edge of the window, and with a burst of strength, she pushed herself through. The cold night air hit her face as she dropped to the ground below. For a moment, she couldn't move, the impact of the fall jarring her body. But adrenaline surged through her, and she pushed herself up, scanning her surroundings. She was outside, free for the first time in weeks, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't risk getting caught. Abdullah would be furious, and his men would be after her. Lara sprinted through the darkness, her footsteps barely making a sound on the gravel path. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she couldn't go back. Every step took her further away from the mansion and from Abdullah's control. As she ran, her breath coming in short gasps, she realized just how much she had taken her freedom for granted. The world had always seemed so vast before, so full of possibility. Now, it felt like an unfamiliar landscape, one she would have to navigate on her own. But she didn't care. She would fight. She would survive. And no matter what it took, she would make Abdullah regret the day he ever thought he could control her. Lara's legs burned as she pushed forward, the sound of her rapid breathing filling the night air. Her mind raced, and her senses were heightened. Every rustle in the trees, every distant footstep, every shadow seemed to loom larger. But she couldn't afford to stop. Not yet. She had to put as much distance between herself and the mansion as possible. The darkness of the night seemed to swallow her, the moonlight barely offering any guidance. Her feet stumbled over uneven ground, but she kept running, driven by sheer instinct. Every part of her body screamed for rest, but Lara ignored it. She could feel the eyes of Abdullah's men searching for her, could almost hear the panic in their voices as they discovered her escape. But she wasn't going to make it easy for them. She had learned the hard way that survival meant staying hidden, staying unnoticed. A few miles from the mansion, Lara slowed to a brisk walk, trying to catch her breath. Her clothes were torn, her skin scratched from branches and thorny bushes, but she had to keep moving. She couldn't afford to show weakness. Her mind was constantly scanning, calculating the next step, searching for a safe place to lay low. She wasn't sure where she was, or even if she could trust the road ahead, but she couldn't go back. She would not let Abdullah win. In the distance, a small village appeared, its lights twinkling like distant stars in the vast blackness. A glimmer of hope flickered within her. There were people there, a chance to find help, to find shelter. Lara made her way toward the village, each step feeling heavier than the last, but she couldn't stop now. The village seemed peaceful enough, a contrast to the storm of emotions raging inside her. She approached cautiously, checking for any signs of danger, before she walked into the first alleyway she could find. Her heart skipped a beat as she heard footsteps behind her. She froze, blending into the shadows, her body tense with fear. Was it them? Had Abdullah's men found her already? The footsteps grew louder, closer. Lara's pulse quickened, and her mind raced for an escape. But then, a voice called out from the shadows. "Are you okay?" The voice was soft, cautious. Lara's eyes widened, and she turned to face the speaker. A young man, dressed in simple clothes, stood just a few feet away. His expression was kind, but there was a wariness in his eyes, as if he had seen too much darkness to trust easily. I'm fine," Lara stammered, her voice hoarse. She couldn't reveal too much, not yet. She needed help, but she couldn't risk giving away her story just to anyone. "You don't look fine," he said, his voice gentle but insistent. "Come with me. It's not safe to be out here at night." Lara hesitated, glancing around once more to ensure she wasn't being followed. Her instinct screamed at her to run, to stay hidden, but the young man's kindness tugged at her. Finally, after a long moment, she nodded, her trust in him wavering but still there. He led her down the alley and into a small, modest house tucked away from the main road. Inside, Lara collapsed into a chair, her body finally giving in to exhaustion. The man quickly offered her water, and she drank it greedily, her throat dry from the long hours of running. "You're safe here," he said, his voice reassuring but cautious. "I won't ask questions, but you should get some rest." Lara didn't need to be told twice. Her body ached, and her mind felt like it was on the verge of shutting down. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to relax, even if just for a moment. But as she closed her eyes, the weight of the situation crashed down on her. Abdullah would not stop. He would come after her, and when he did, there would be no mercy. Lara knew her survival was far from guaranteed. But in this moment, in this small, safe place, she allowed herself to believe that there was a chance to regain everything she had lost, and she would fight for it no matter what. Lara awoke to the sound of soft murmurs outside the room. Her mind was foggy, but her senses were immediately on alert. She glanced around the dimly lit room, the walls still unfamiliar. The young man who had helped her was sitting in a chair near the door, reading a book. As her eyes met his, he gave her a small, reassuring smile. "You've been asleep for a while," he said quietly, closing the book and setting it aside. Lara nodded, her body still exhausted from the escape. But the adrenaline was already beginning to rise again, a constant hum under her skin. She had only just begun to settle into the safety of the moment when she heard a sound, distant but unmistakable, the crunch of gravel underfoot. Her heart skipped a beat. Was it Abdullah's men? The young man noticed her tense posture and quickly moved to the window. His eyes scanned the street below, and for a long moment, he didn't say anything. Lara's breath caught in her throat as she held her own gaze on him, waiting for any sign of danger. "Don't worry," he finally said, his voice low and calm. "They're just villagers. They won't harm you." Lara didn't relax immediately. Her mind was racing, every instinct telling her to run, to hide. She knew better than to trust anyone too easily. The fear of being found out was a constant presence, gnawing at the edges of her mind. But something about this young man felt different. There was no ulterior motive, no hidden agenda in his eyes, just genuine concern. Lara finally allowed herself a deep breath, though the tension in her chest didn't completely ease. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. He gave her a small nod. "You're welcome. But you're going to need more than rest to get through what's ahead." Lara felt a cold shiver run through her. What was ahead? "You don't know who I am, do you?" she asked, her voice now steady, though a hint of vulnerability remained. He raised an eyebrow. "I don't," he replied simply. Lara's thoughts began to swirl as she considered her options. She couldn't stay here forever. But where could she go? Abdullah had the resources to track her down anywhere. "I'm a pilot," she began, her voice calm, but filled with a weight of sorrow. "A former pilot. I used to fly for a private airline, but everything changed." She hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "I'm on the run from someone very dangerous." The young man didn't flinch. Instead, he sat down next to her, his expression serious. "I understand," he said quietly. "You're safe here for now, but you can't stay in one place for too long." Lara nodded, the reality of her situation slowly sinking in. She had to keep moving. Every second counted. The young man leaned in, his voice urgent. "You'll need more than luck to escape. Whoever's chasing you is powerful, and they won't give up until they find you." Lara's heart clenched. She knew he was right. Abdullah wouldn't stop. She had seen the lengths he would go to for revenge, and she had no illusions about his ruthlessness. "But you're not alone," the young man continued, his voice soft yet firm. "You have people who want to help. People who can get you out of here and keep you safe." Lara looked at him, uncertainty flashing in her eyes. "You don't even know me?" Her voice cracked slightly. "You don't know what I've done?" The young man's expression softened. "It doesn't matter what you've done. What matters now is who you are and what you can become. You have the power to change your fate, Lara." His words hit her like a lightning bolt, igniting something deep inside. She had been living in fear for so long, barely surviving, that she had forgotten what it felt like to be in control of her own life. For the first time in what felt like forever, Lara began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could fight back. She stood up slowly, her legs still weak, but her resolve hardening. "I can't stay here. I can't hide forever," she said, determination creeping into her voice. The young man nodded. "Then we move. We take the first step, and we don't stop until we're free." Lara felt the fire inside her grow stronger, and with that, she took the first step toward reclaiming her life, no longer just surviving, but fighting to make her future hers once more. Lara's heart beat with a renewed sense of purpose as she and the young man, whose name was Rami, made their way through the quiet village streets. It had been weeks since she had escaped the clutches of Abdullah, but the tension never fully left her. Every shadow, every flicker of movement, made her jump, ready to flee, ready to fight. But this time, something inside her had changed. As they walked toward the outskirts of the village, Rami spoke again, his voice calm but filled with unspoken promise. "There's a place, hidden, far away from here. Safe. We can get you there, Lara. No one will follow." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of doubt, any sign of hidden motives. But there was nothing but sincerity. Rami had kept his words so far, offering her shelter, food, and even a small sense of peace when she had believed there was none. Her body was bruised, scarred, but her spirit was alive, stronger than ever. The fear of Abdullah, his power, his reach, still lingered, but now Lara saw a way out. "We're close," Rami said, interrupting her thoughts. He pointed toward a narrow path leading into the mountains. Lara squinted against the setting sun, noticing the distant silhouette of a building hidden between the hills. The journey was long, and the path was not easy. But with each step, Lara felt her fear loosen its grip. Rami guided her without hesitation, and despite the exhaustion weighing heavily on her, Lara pressed on. As night fell, they reached the hidden house, far from the chaos, the danger, and the life that had once defined her. It was simple, almost primitive, but it was a place of refuge. Inside, Lara collapsed onto a bed that smelled of fresh linens and wood, the weight of the past few months finally catching up with her. But there was no sense of finality, only the promise of a new beginning. Abdullah's shadow was still out there, and Lara knew the war wasn't over. But she had learned something in these long weeks of running and hiding. Survival wasn't just about escaping. It was about finding strength within oneself to fight back, to rebuild. And for the first time in a long time, Lara believed that she could. As she drifted into a peaceful sleep, she knew that her journey was far from finished. But now, at least, she had the courage to face whatever came next.